Another huge round of applause for our fearless leadership in Marge Dean as well. We didn't have a moment to thank her. Thank you, Marge, for uplifting our voices every day. We really appreciate you for that. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Julianne Crommett. My day job is that I'm the Vice President of Multicultural Audience Engagement at the Walt Disney Studios, and I am very proud to be WIA's secretary and serve on the Executive Committee of Women in Animation. So with that, this morning, we're going to have a talk. I'm going to sort of present to you some ideas, vocabulary. We're going to do a refresher on unconscious bias. So for those of us who weren't here last year, you'll have a little bit of a taste of what I presented last year, but also for all of us who were, it is always a good refresher to remember our unconscious biases and how pernicious they are in every day of our life, right? It can never happen too much. And then I'm going to take you through a bit of the data of what Hollywood looks like today. Then we're going to go through the business case as to why inclusion is important in our storytelling and to our audience. Then I'm going to go through some case studies of people who have been doing some amazing work to combat their unconscious biases and to promote inclusion and where it's led to results. And then I'll transition us into some thinking for the rest of the day that hopefully will inspire some thought, some action, and I really encourage you to keep talking all the way into the reception. To note, we won't be doing Q&A after any session just because of time, but keep those questions because we want to keep talking throughout the day at our lunch breaks and in the evening at the reception. So with that, here's a little bit about me. Who am I? So I'm actually Puerto Rican and Cuban. I was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Spanish is actually my first language. English is my second. Mira, look at that. I just tricked you all. And so I always like to share that because I pass in daily life, right? I pass because I look white to most people in the United States. Unless I'm in New York City, they don't tend to see me as Puerto Rican or Cuban. But I say this to say that we are all many things. And intersectionality is the discussion that we are all many things. And any given moment in life, we can fall into many categories and that we are not defined by just one. I share all this because I made the choice not to choose between different categories because of the man that's in this photo. So this was my godfather, Paco Pardo. He was an actor and a movie critic. He also passed away of a heart attack when I was 8 years old, suddenly. He was 37 when he passed. And he was the person that single-handedly inspired me to want to be in entertainment, to want to make a change, to see myself in some way on screen. And he was also a huge technology geek. So I think that's where my love of animation comes from, is those things meeting. And what I love about animation is it's the place where we don't have to choose between different parts of our identity or different parts of our passion. And that's what really drove me to be in this work today. The other thing that drove me to be in this work is that after he died, I really didn't see role models like myself on screen until an amazing woman named Ugly Betty. Betty la Fea, if you know from Spanish, and the talented actor America Ferrera. And it was the first time in my life, and mind you, I was already, I think, in college at the time, that I saw myself on screen. Yes, I had glasses and braces, everybody. There is a photo where I look terribly like this. And that also, what was wonderful about her is that she worked in a corporate American environment, but her home life was like my home life. Her family looked like my family, acted like my family, and yet she was still able to be herself. Every day that she walked in that office, she was unabashedly herself. She wore crazy clothes, she had cool style, all right, maybe I picked up a little bit of that, but that she was also somebody who was just not afraid and didn't have to choose. And that for me was the first time I saw that on screen, and I'd like to note that actually the next Latina in a leading role in a television show, especially comedy or dramedy, wasn't until Gina Rodriguez in Jane the Virgin, which was a decade later. And so this will come into illustration as we talk about representation on screen and why it's so important. But I always want you to remember, who was the Ugly Betty in your life? Who inspired you to want to be in this industry and see yourself? And how can we make sure more kids don't miss the opportunity to see themselves in this industry and to see themselves represented on screen? So beyond the business case, beyond everything else, always keep that in the back of your mind as you go into your work every day. So with that, we're going to kick off with some definitions. If you were with us last year, I went over unconscious bias. So unconscious bias, to level set another definition for us, is the result of shortcuts that our brain takes because of the amount of data we have to process at any given moment. So I'm going to say that again. It's the result of shortcuts that our brain takes because of the amount of data we have to process at any given moment. We're going to dive into what that means in just a little while, but I want you to hold on to that. Okay, so my brain's making shortcuts. Diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So inclusion is the theme for this year's summit, but I always like to group these three words together because you see them a lot in today's day and age, and it's like, what do they mean and how are they different? So I'm going to give you a short, quippy way of remembering this. I did not invent it, by the way. It's been used by a lot of sort of diversity and inclusion practitioners over the years. But diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And belonging is that your music is played and you can boogie. And so we're all trying to get to boogieing, right? All right. So let's hold on to these definitions throughout the day. The result of shortcuts that my brain takes because of the amount of data I have to process at any given moment, being invited to the party, being asked to dance, and that my music is played and I can boogie. You got it? All right, so we're gonna hold on to those. Talking about unconscious bias. So a little refresher from last year. Remember, I want you to go back, way back with me to the original form of animation, as you can see. These are cave paintings, folks. And we've decided today to become proto-humans, perhaps on the African savannah, and we decided to check our biases at the door. And so we look off in the distance, and we see an animal, and it's a little bit bigger than an aardvark, a little bit smaller, and we have become lunch. Yes, ladies and gents, we are the descendants of the nervous people, the ones that made a snap judgment, use our unconscious biases, and ran the other way as fast as we could, yeah? And so our unconscious biases for many years were good for our survival. It actually ensured we stayed alive. But today's world, and this is Times Square in New York City, today's world might be a little bit more complicated. We receive about 11 million bits of information at any given moment. 11 million bits. I want you to process that. And we can only consciously process 40 bits. So folks, if you're doing the math, 99.999996% of everything we think is unconscious. 99.999996%. Whew. Okay, so what does that mean? And you're thinking, Julianne, and you were here last year. I don't want you to give it a spoiler of the exercise we're about to do. This is about to become interactive, everybody, and I know it's the morning, but I know you have it in you. So we're going to do an experiment called an implicit association test, or IAT. How many of you took it with me last year or have taken it online since? Fabulous. About a quarter to half of the room. Wonderful. So great. Don't spoil it for the others, but we're going to do it again. You're going to see a series of 4 sets of slides that come up. An implicit association test, if you took it online, it's from Project Implicit from Harvard University. If you take it online, what you're going to see is a word in the middle of the screen and then a word on your right and your left of the screen. And if you were at your computer, you would hit your keyboard and it would recognize how fast you were matching the word in the middle with the word on the right or the word on the left. Association, yeah? And so it would give you a report at the end of how you did. Now today, we're obviously not in front of computers, so we're gonna yell out left or right to where the word in the middle matches, either the right or the left. Does that make sense? So, and you'll get the hang of it. We'll do it 4 times. I have full faith in this crowd because you got about a quarter of you have done it before. So I got full faith. The second set, by the way, just not to throw you off, is it's going to have 1 word on the right and 1 word on the left. The second set will have 2 words on the right and 2 words on the left, and you have to match it with either of the words. And here's a quick cheat. They're all the same words, and they're color-coded. I have full faith in you. Are you ready? And remember, I want you loud and proud to yell right or left. Okay? Here we go. All right, Annecy. You've come to play Women in Animation Summit. So much so, we're going to do new words. All right. Liberal arts, to translate, is like the humanities, and sciences are the hard sciences. Yes? Are you ready? Here we go. pretty good. We had a few fall off. I heard some giggling. We get into school, and people sort of freak out for a second, but it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. So much so, look what we've done here. They're the same words. So remember, either of the words on the right or either of the words on the left, same words, and they're color-coded. Are you ready? Okay, so we struggled a little bit, but we kind of got it together by the end. You felt that, yes? I have so much faith in you, though. I do, because ready? So look what happened. Yes. All right, here we go. Same words, everybody, color-coded. You've got this. All right. That might have been the most brilliant time this has ever worked out. How many of you felt a slowdown on that last one? It was a little bit harder? Yeah, wonderful. You can't lie to me, because all we heard was left, right, left. Oh, no, Julianne. Yes. So you're not alone. If you were with us last year, I said this as well. You're not alone. 70%, 70% of the world that has taken these tests online with Project Implicit from Harvard has done exactly what you did, which is that you slowed down on the anti-stereotypical pairing. So what that last set would have been considered as anti-stereotypical, because our brain is wired to essentially less associate women with the sciences and men with liberal arts. It's not that we consciously believe, I don't think any of us, that women can't be associated with the sciences or men with liberal arts. It just takes our brain a split second longer to process that association, because essentially it's short-circuiting. You just felt your brain short-circuit. The synapse couldn't fire at the same rate. And that can be caused by a lot of things in society: imprinting, visibility, culture, media, a lot of reasons for it. But essentially, it slows down. And any time there's an anti-stereotypical pairing, you slow down, no matter what the vertical of identity. So I really encourage you, if you enjoyed that, if you thought it was interesting, please go ahead and Google Project Implicit. You can take more of these tests online across other forms of identity, and you might be surprised at where you shake out. But I always want to tell you this, because you should never feel shame when these things happen. Our brains haywire on us. So the more that we're aware of this, the more we talk about it, the more we can actually do something about it. And so don't ever feel shamed or embarrassed when that happens to you. Just make sure that you're calling each other on it when it does happen, so we start to break it down and it happens less often. Make sense? So even a tiny bit of bias can have big consequences. I want you to think about every time your brain does that short-circuiting, what happens if it adds up across different verticals of identity, right? Or different ideas. Could you start to think about people in a different way? Could we start to judge capability? Could we start to judge what we're capable of or what we believe is possible for ourselves, right? It can start to have those big consequences. So with that, just a little vocabulary recap for everybody. Social biases. So this is one of the most common forms of bias, and it's very popular amongst the phrase "like me" bias. So like me bias, for those of you who were last year, is no surprise, is that we as humans tend to like people who are like us. Very self-centered in that way, we are. And so I want you to think about what happens when you meet somebody or you see a resume or a portfolio from somebody who's from your same school, went to your same university or school, or who's from your same hometown. You know that little warm, fuzzy feeling you get in your stomach? You know nothing about this person except they went to the same university or from your same hometown. But that's like me bias. You just preference them a little bit more than somebody who wasn't from your school or who wasn't from your same hometown. And so I want you to think about that. And a friend of mine, she used to say when we would present together, I want you to think about everybody you grew up with or everybody you went to university with. Did you like all of those people? Right, exactly. So it works really nicely, like me bias or social biases, with memory bias. So a common form of memory bias, and memory bias is just the biases that happen in the way our brain processes memory, just like social bias is the way we process social interactions with each other. So a common type of memory bias is recency bias. So recency bias is that we tend to remember the most recent pieces of information that we've received, and then we substitute it for the whole data set. So what that means is that when you might be doing a performance review on somebody, or you're thinking about who to hire, you may remember the most recent 3 months of interaction with that person, and maybe instead of the whole year or 2 years that you've worked together. And then think about if they're like you in any way. And it's a combo. Suddenly, you've preferenced somebody perhaps because they're like you and you've had a positive interaction with them in the last 3 months. And then maybe somebody isn't like you and you've had a negative interaction with them in the last 3 months. Suddenly, you've just pushed these people apart like that, all based on 2 forms of bias, right? So I want you to think about when am I just locking into the most recent piece of information and I'm substituting it for the whole, okay? And it works really nicely with decision-making bias. So decision-making bias is the bias that comes from previous decisions that we've made, and we consider that the same outcome is going to happen just because it's always happened before. And we don't go back and question the decision or question the data behind the decision. A very common form of this happened in marketing around films, at least in the United States, where for about 20 years, we were as an industry marketing movies to moms or women because we thought moms took their kids more often to the movies than dads, mothers more than fathers. And it turns out in 20 years, a lot has happened in society, and fathers are actually taking their kids more to the movies than moms. And we had missed an opportunity to change the decision when that data actually changed because we kind of kept doing it, not really thinking necessarily it had shifted. Now, everybody in Hollywood knows this, and we actually market movies more to dads. But I want you to think about what's that data I've been relying on or that decision I've been making that I haven't gone back and questioned. Have things changed since I started making that decision? And how could I look at data maybe differently to understand if something bigger has shifted? And it works really nicely with probability and belief bias. So probability and belief bias is not that you even made a decision before. It's literally that you have a belief or that you statistically believe something's going to happen, so you keep doing the same behavior over and over again and not questioning the data or going back and looking. A version of this just happened in the entertainment business, actually with my company and with Marvel Studios, with a little film called Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. What's amazing is there'd been this myth for about 20 years that black-led movies don't sell outside the United States. And it turns out that $1.3 billion later, they do. And what's amazing, yeah, right? That's right, South Africa's in the house. I love it. And Nigeria, yes, I love it. And so with that, what it's done is actually shattered a myth around probability and belief. Because suddenly there's a data set, and we've actually started to look at the data, and it's translating differently. And so I want you to think, what are those deeply held beliefs? What is that thing I believe is probably going to happen and I haven't gone back and looked at the data? Could be in your personal life, could be in your professional life. And try to break that. And again, it works really nicely with decision-making bias. It might also be questioning a decision that's led to that belief or that probability, or vice versa, that the probability of belief has kept leading you to the same decisions. So think about that data. And so with that, just a quick example, for those who were here last year, don't spoil it. If everybody could pull out your phone, if you have it with you. Again, this is interactive, folks. It's the morning. We got to stay awake. So this is a real-life example from my time at Google. It is published. If you want to go read about it, it's really interesting. So everybody, if you are predominantly right-handed, if you could hold your phone up in the air the way you would watch a video on your phone if you wanted to watch it landscape or in a wider screen aspect ratio. All right, perfect. Right-handed folks, which way did you turn your phone for the aspect ratio? Left for the most part? Yeah. And we have a few, I know the two-handers out there, you can't cheat, all right, because you turn it both ways, all right? And then the left-handed folks in the room are people who use your phone in your left hand. Typically, which way do you turn your phone? To the right. Yeah? So when YouTube iOS Uploader launched for the first time, about 10% of the videos were loading upside down and nobody could figure out why. So about 10% of the global population is left-handed, and there were no left-handed engineers on the design team of the iOS uploader. And I use this example because it wasn't that the right-handed engineers went in that day and thought, today's the day. We're gonna get the lefties. It was that they literally didn't think to turn the phone the other way. It wasn't their user experience, it wasn't their life, it was their blind spot. And it caused time, money, and a PR crisis that could have been avoided by simply having somebody who used their phone in their left hand, or a left-handed individual, and we could have solved the whole thing right away. So when you think about diversity and inclusion, think about it across many aspects of identity. In this particular case, it was diversity of thought or experience, right? And it was left-handed or right-handedness. And so think about how much time, money, energy can be saved if we're inclusive and we put all those voices around the table. Which leads us to the topic of inclusion. Remember, being invited to dance. We're taking it back to the definition, being invited to dance, today's theme. So what does it mean, more formally? It's the process of including and using the power of differences and similarities to achieve a common goal or objective. I think it's an amazing definition, actually. The process of including and using the power of differences and similarities to achieve a common goal or objective. So that's what we're talking about when we say inclusion, more formally. And when you combine it with intersectionality, which is an analytic framework which attempts to identify how interlocking systems of power impact those who are most marginalized in society. So it's the idea of the systems we live in, are multiple identities that can affect us, and when that happens, it can lead to further marginalization or a difference of access, yeah? And intersectionality considers the various forms of what it sees as social stratification, such as class, race, sexual orientation, age, disability, and gender, and they don't exist separately from each other, but are rather complexly interwoven. So again, it's the idea that we are not just one thing, we are many things interwoven together at any moment in our life, and that can change at any moment in our life. It's a fluid thing as well. And so when we think about what it means to achieve 50-50 by 2025 in the essence of WIA, or we think about what it means to achieve parity or to achieve representation, we have to think about it in the interlocking forms of identity. Not simply just one category at a time, but in all the ways that we exist. And so you ask yourself, why does inclusion matter? And there's a lot of business studies on this that prove that it does to the bottom line of a business, but it leads to higher reported innovation, time and time again. Actually, in a study from Deloitte and Burson last year, it leads to greater financial results. You exceed or meet financial targets, sometimes by 2 times over. And it allows for going beyond the call of duty, the idea that you become agile and that you're able to adapt to any change, either in your industry or in the problem you're trying to solve or in the solution you're trying to derive. So I'm positing the question to you all today. Think about, what does inclusion matter at your organization or in your work? What does it matter as you leave here today and you think about the way you're set up or what you can do to change up who's in the room, that those left-handed engineers make an appearance, yeah? Think about what that means as we go throughout the day today. So I always like to ground us in data. I think it's good for us to have a picture of what inclusion looks like in the industry right now, or to some extent doesn't. So this is from on-screen images of films. This data is both from the USC Annenberg Inclusion Study as well as the UCLA Bunch Center initiative. And I will be quoting a lot of these studies for the next few minutes. So 34% of on-screen speaking characters are women. These are from the top films year over year. So this stat is from, I believe, 2016, which is the newest data we have. But it stays pretty consistent. It's increased slightly over time since 2007. 34% of on-screen speaking characters are women. It's 31% animation in 2016. And then 31% are lead or co-leads. I want you to look at the number, though, that I put in red. It is 3% if you think about women of color. So what that means is when you combine race and ethnicity with gender, right, the data point drops to 3% of leads or co-leads are women of color, which means the majority of leads or co-leads that are women are white. And so these are the implications of what happens when intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, disability, you start to see that percentages shift because often the attention is not put on those intersections, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about today. 71% of on-screen speaking characters are white. 51% are white for animation. So that's 49% non-white for people who are doing the math. The reason for that 2016 stat, which we should be very proud of, by the way, because that's basically 50-50 in 2016, due in large part to two films, Kubo and the Two Strings, and Disney's own Moana, which you could be very proud of. So a little shout out there to the Walt Disney Animation folks. And so that's where you see that spike. I think it was an over 30% increase from the year before. So look what happens, the impact of two movies on total speaking characters. So when you think about percentage impact, that's pretty high. So think about the impact year over year on just a few movies, even being added in, you can see change pretty quickly. 86% leads or co-leads were white. So again, it's not too hard to believe that 3% women of color number if you look at the two stats together, right? So we go to scripted cable series in the US. I specifically picked this out because animation tends to air on mostly on cable in the US, only in a few places on broadcast television, and streaming is only now starting up, so the data is less available all the time. 42% of on-screen speaking characters are women. It drops to 12% for women of color, so again, that intersectional piece. And 45% lead or co-lead, which is almost 50-50, pretty great. Again, we need to focus on the intersectional points of identity when we think about race, ethnicity, gender in terms of sexuality, as well as also people with disabilities. And then if you look at race and ethnicity in isolation, 75% of on-screen speaking roles are white, 80% lead or co-lead. So again, not seeing too much movement there, but it's starting to go in the right direction. Then if you look at directors of the top 100 films in 2016, 4% were women, and it goes to less than 1% if you look at women of color, which means we can name them. And then if you look at race or ethnicity, it's 90% white. This has been written about extensively. We're on it, as we like to say in the industry. This again is data through 2016, does not reflect 2017 data or 2018 data, which is if you've been watching the news, there is a whole lot of women helmers that are taking over films right now. So I would expect to see a percent shift in these numbers over the next year to 2 years. So stay tuned. I don't think this is the whole story yet. But thankfully, we've paid attention and looked, which is great. And then if you look on creators of US scripted cable TV series, so again, paralleling the data, 17% of creators are women. Again, a number that I think will continue to increase year over year. In 2017, 2018, we're starting to see some great creators who are women putting shows on the air in cable and in streaming. So we should start to see increase in those numbers as well. And again, 93% of creators are white. So again, another opportunity to look at all the other intersections of identity as we talk about this. And then a little international. There is not, unfortunately, too much research in looking at the global film market total and altogether. This is from a study published in 2016 from the Gina Davis Institute in partnership with USC, I believe. And 21% of filmmakers globally in 11 countries were women. That end count is how many total directors we looked at, 1,452 in that study. So it gives you an idea. Slightly higher, but country by country it varies depending on the market. It's good to note that it also looked at US-UK co-productions as well, so seeing the influence of two countries also working together. So I wanted to make sure to include this so you kind of see where we are in a global context. Again, only through 2016, so we'll hopefully keep having revised data as we go on with our summits year over year that will hopefully start to see that same shift that we're seeing here in the United States. I also hope we see in other countries as well. I think the movement is beginning and moving along. So why does this matter in the industry? This is the business case, everybody. So here we go. If you look at the gender in the box office domestically in the United States of who shows up to movies in 2016, if you see across the movies, two of which are animated, Secret Life of Pets and Finding Dory, and to an extent, The Jungle Book. It is basically 50-50, male-female. And then if you look over there at ethnicity and race, it is almost 50-50 people of color and white people who are showing up to the movie theaters in equal measure. So that's who's showing up to movies. And if you look in 2017, it stays pretty consistent. Again, 51-49, and then 53 and 47% total. So this is actually who's showing up to the movie theater to watch movies on an annual basis. And then you look at box office return and share of audience. So if you see, this is from 2015 films, again from the UCLA Bunch Center study. Look at the audience share on those top 10 movies. If you look, the majority of them have around 50% or more people of color that have shown up and bought a ticket to the film. So again, there's an essence of who's coming to the movie theater and who's showing up. And then this one is one of my favorites, everybody. This is peak return on box office, and this is global box office, everybody. I want you to take a look at something. I'm highlighting in red where all the bolding is. See that? Notice a pattern. So this is cast diversity on the axis where you see percentages. That's the percentage of people of color in a cast on screen. And if you'll notice, across every genre of film, the highest return of global box office and peak box office comes in at 20% or higher cast diversity. Again, independent of genre, it holds true across the board. And I want you to look at animation is at 41 to 50% diversity, cast diversity. And then if you look over at horror, over 50%. We'll probably see something similar in 2017 considering Get Out and Jordan Peele's work in the horror category. And I share this to say that the argument is strong no matter which genre of film you look at, that on-screen representation matters and is translating to box office dollars. And for those who are a bit of data geeks, if you'll notice the end counts, so the actual number of films in each box, the numbers are lower the more diverse the cast, yet they're returning the higher box office. So the industry as a whole is making fewer movies at the 21% or higher as a whole, but that is where the highest return is. So if you're looking at the data, that's where you're going to want to cast your movie, is in that 21% or higher. So just think about that as you go along and you're thinking about and you're trying to make arguments around casting in your films. This, I think, is one of the strongest examples of what that looks like. And this, for fun, is the 2016 numbers. It stays consistent in aggregate. 21 to 30% is at 179.2 million box office return, and then you look at 31 to 40%, again, the second highest number. So it's holding true year over year since 2011. So it's not necessarily a trend, it's sort of here to stay. So how are we thinking about our films as we think about this data? And then this, for fun, I've added cable TV ratings as well. So again, cast diversity on the bottom axis. You can see, same idea, people of color represented. This is also from UCLA's Bunch Center study, Hollywood Diversity Report. And then I want you to notice the spike there in the over 50% category with the black audience. So a parallel to seeing oneself on screen, an incredible tune-in to a show with seeing one's representation. And this holds true again in 2016. You can see pretty much exactly the same data point. Average is 31 to 40% now, is where you're seeing the highest rating in terms of cast mix. And then again, with the black audience, you're seeing an overperformance at the over 50% category mark. So again, if you're thinking about it from a television angle, there are dividends to be made in thinking about cast diversity as part of the projects you're putting together. So given all that, what are others doing to address this? Obviously, there's an amazing business case. We're all fighting our unconscious biases, and there's an amazing way to think about inclusion that's going to pay dividends. So with that, I'm going to use this example because it's an oldie but a goodie, and those, again, don't ruin it if you were here last year. The orchestra and philharmonic example. How many people remember this from last year? You've heard it before. Great. So orchestras and philharmonics, and this is obviously related industry and music. In the late 70s and early 80s, orchestras were about the same percentage female that we see today in a lot of industries, 17%. 17%. And nobody could figure out why, because the schools, the conservatories, and the art schools that were graduating musicians were graduating at a 50-50 rate, female-male. And so an intrepid philharmonic had the idea of putting a curtain up during auditions so nobody could see the player, right? They only heard the music. Because, you know, in an orchestra or philharmonic, the music's the most important thing, yeah? And the percentage went up year over year of how many women they hired by a slight amount. It went up into the 20th percentile. And then that same philharmonic had the intrepid idea of putting carpet down on the stage. Yes, folks, it was the sound of people's shoes that had subconsciously primed the judges. Because when they put that carpet down, 50-50 hiring in 1 year. 50-50 hiring in 1 year. It's been written about extensively. And so what it was removing as much bias as possible to make inclusion possible in the orchestra. And now that is a standard practice in every Philharmonic and orchestra across the whole world. Anybody here who was a fan of Amazon's Mozart in the Jungle with Gael Garcia Bernal? I was, at least. Yeah, I see some hands. So hands right, loud and proud. Let's see them. Right on. It's been canceled, so we can all cry together later. But if you watch the show, actually, and you watch any of the audition scenes in the show, there's a curtain up and there's carpet on the stage. It's art imitating life, right? And so I want you to think about, what are those processes that I'm engaging with on a daily basis where if I removed the opportunity for bias, could we see a different result as long as we have equity coming in on the front end, we have that representation coming in on the front end, because that's the key part of that example. It was 50-50 graduating. And so then when you made the process fairer, you got the result on the other end. But again, if it's not showing up on the front end, then the process won't change it totally. So you have to think about that as part of it. And so with that, it's really about knowing and sharing your data. This is one of the most important things I can share with you today, which is all of us, I shared a lot of data with you that's out there that's publicly available. I want you to really think about what's that data that I need to know and understand so that I can go back and reevaluate those decisions I've been making. I can reevaluate maybe that probability and belief bias I've been engaging in. And maybe the data helps me make the business case in different ways that I didn't think about. So remember to know and share your data. These are a bunch of the different resources that are available to you that publish great data. Women in Film, Dina Davis Institute, University of Southern California, Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism, Sundance Institute, the Bunch Center at UCLA, and that's a snapshot from USC's Annenberg most recent inclusion report. So really, take a look, and then if you're not seeing the data, let's have a conversation about it and see how can we get there, yeah? And then with that, and if you have your data and you're thinking about the orchestra and philharmonic example, this is an example that takes it into late night comedy and applies it right into our business. Anybody here a fan of Samantha Bee and or John Oliver? Almost the whole room. Yeah, you're doing a great job, those shows. Look at that. So Samantha Bee and John Oliver, they launched their late night comedy shows just about a year apart from each other. John Oliver went first. And John, at the time, there's a large conversation about women in comedy and absence of women in comedy. And John said, well, wait a second. There's got to be something going on here. So he took a cue from the Philharmonics and the orchestras, and he said, I'm going to make a blind review process. And so what they did is they took the names off all the sketch packet submissions for being hired on their show. And they just put numbers. And so that way you couldn't know who anybody was until the final interview. And so that's what they did, and they ended up with the most amount of women in late night at the time, which was 2. But hey, it's an improvement. I applaud improvement. And the other thing I should note is that they made sure all the packets were submitted in the same order, that all of the material was in the same order for each person, so you didn't have an inconsistency in how you looked at the packets. And then Samantha Bee came along a year later because John did the very important thing of talking about what he did publicly. He talked about it. He didn't keep it to himself. He talked about what he tried. And so Samantha Bee saw it and went, well, wait a second, John. I wonder if there's bias slipping in earlier in the process. Remember that whole 50-50 with the orchestras that it had to be there at the beginning? And so she said, if you're going to the same places looking for the same talent and that talent representation isn't there, then we're not going to see it on the other end. So her team went far and wide. They scoured the internet. They went to different interest organizations. They just went farther out looking for voices and their usual suspects. And then they did the same process. They took the names off the sketch packets, asked everybody to submit in the same order, and the result at the end was the most diverse room in late night at the time, which was 50-50, female-male, and 30% from underrepresented groups, which is pretty remarkable. And I should note that both of these shows were nominated for Emmys in their first year out the gate. So there was not a creative trade-off for doing this, but rather a creative boost. Because in comedy particularly, the idea of creative abrasion, the idea of different opinions in an inclusive and safe room, bumping together, right, scratching each other in terms of ideas, leads to better material, better jokes, the deeper thought, the deeper creative place. And so one might argue that by making the rooms more inclusive, they actually ended up servicing their creative in a different way. So again, think about who do I need to invite in my room and what are the ways my room could look, and then what process might I change to see voices that I might not have heard from before, I might not have considered in the same way, not because I meant to, but just because of my own unconscious biases. And that's the way into the space of inclusion. This is from Knowing Your Own Data. It's a great example from FX. So if you notice, this is the TV episodes directed by white men from 2014 to 2015. By the way, I'm proud to say selfishly that ABC is at the top of that heap and continues to grow in representation. But if you look down there at FX, that's a pretty striking difference. And again, by the way, this is something that the TV industry is hitting hard. So again, 17, 18 data are going to be really fascinating for us to look at. But at the time, John Landgraf, who was the president of FX, took a look at this data and went, wait a second, something's going on here. And so he called every showrunner on his air, and he talked to them about it. And he talked about this very publicly later. And he said, I want more diversity in the directing ranks, but I'm not going to leave you to do it alone. You're going to have my creative team to back you up. You're going to have the diversity and inclusion team to back you up. And in 1 year, they went from last to first. In 1 year. 49% white men and then 51% everybody else. It flip-flopped, basically, in a way. And when John talked about it, he said, we just put focus on it. And the other thing is, they weren't afraid to break people for their first episode of television, which is that somebody had never directed an episode of TV before, and they said, well, we're going to take a shot on you. And John said, I don't want to slow down by that because I believe we'll find voices, and that's exactly what happened. I've heard him talk about it since, and they've had tremendous success with pretty much every director they broke into their first episode of TV. They either asked them back or they went on to direct more episodes of television elsewhere in the industry. So what's incredible, of course, is that creates a ripple effect of experienced directors into the rest of the television industry. And I share this story because if you're a leader in this room, and I think we're all leaders in different ways, but particularly if you're a leader, look at the opportunity to break the mold, or we can think about data a little bit differently, and use that then to create a focused effort in the places where you want to target looking at representation and looking at equity as part of your lineup. And remember, don't leave people hanging in the wind when you ask them to do this. Provide them the backup and support to get it done. Because that was the really important part of what John did, besides talking about it publicly, is he provided his teams that backup so that they could find people, they could get them ready, and then they could be successful. So as you think about this, remember your data and then figure out what's that patterning I want to do toward inclusion. This is a great example of inclusion, but specifically within the context of meeting rooms, because we're in meetings all day, often. This is from the fabulous Glenn Mazzara, who you see in this picture. He show ran seasons 2 and 3 of The Walking Dead, most recently Damien, and is a huge advocate on inclusion in the industry. And he tells the story that he was running a writer's room all the way back on The Shield with Sean Ryan. And he noticed that these 2 female writers were not speaking up, and he couldn't figure out why. So he confronted them about it and said, well, why aren't you talking? And they said, well, we would, except we keep getting interrupted. And he's like, what do you mean? And they said, well, just watch. So the next day, he came into the room, and he just watched. He watched the interaction at the table, what was happening, and they were indeed getting interrupted. So the next day, he came in, and he just said, new rule, nobody interrupts anybody when they have a prepared pitch, meaning they're coming in with something prepared to share. Now, if you're sort of just shooting it back and forth, having a spitball session, that's something different. But if you're coming in with that prepared material, everybody had to be heard all the way through. He did not call out it was because of the women. He just said, this is the new rule. And guess what happened? The room became more efficient. They became more creative. He said it started becoming the best run room he ever had in his life, so he's done it on every show since. That's just a policy he has in the room, talks about it very openly. And the other thing that happened is several men came up to him after a couple weeks and said, we really want to thank you for that no interruption rule. And they said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, because we kept getting interrupted. And he was like, what do you mean? Well, it turns out they were the more introverted men in the room. Remember introversion and extroversion? That's another part of identity, folks, intersectionality, yeah? And so it wasn't so obvious visually or auditorially to Glenn, right? The women were more obvious to him visually what was happening, and actually to his ear, right, because of the pitch difference in voices. But it was happening to those men as well. And so by making a rule that actually helped improve the experience for sort of the most affected group in the room, he made it better for everybody. And that's called universal design principle. So when you're thinking about your meeting rooms or places where you can actually change the rules to make it more inclusive for everybody, think about, is it a no interruption rule? Is it asking, where is my blind spot? Like those engineers, right? Where is my blind spot? How can we lead the room differently so everybody has a voice? Do people rotate leading the meeting? Does that change things up a little bit? So think about how to drive inclusion even in those day-to-day practices, which is so simple as even just changing up how you do a meeting. And take a cue from Glenn. This is an example from casting, which I think I shared last year, but I love it. So anybody here a Shonda Rhimes fan of anything Grey's Anatomy, Scandal? Look at that. Shonda, yes. All of those shows on ABC, by the way, yes. So Shonda Rhimes, when she launched Grey's Anatomy and many shows, as you probably know, has talked very openly about inclusion and about representation. And as she says, it's just the world as it is. It's the world as it is, the world we live in. And so you look at this photo, spoiler alert, for those who have not kept up with Grey's Anatomy, some of these characters are no longer with us. They died. And so I won't tell you who, because now you have to catch up. But with Grey's Anatomy, you can see a lot of diversity in the cast already, just by this photo. And so Shonda, who had dedicated her whole career to this, was hearing Gina Davis, the actor, speak about, who's also a researcher, as I mentioned earlier, speak about this idea of background casts, the extras in the background, being only 17% women on average. They found this statistically. Those are literally, I want you to think about this, that's literally somebody walking in the shot in the background, yeah? So on a hospital show, I want you to think about it's the person on the gurney, not even just the person pushing it. So Shonda had never looked at her background cast, she'd figured out. And so she went to her casting director and asked her to pull every single extra that had ever been on Grey's Anatomy. Well, it turns out 17%. 17% women. Shonda Rhimes, who was thinking about this all the time. So, of course, she changed that immediately. All of you who are still sticking with Grey's, awesome. God bless you. Keep watching. But if you look in the background, it's 50-50, female, male now. So, again, who's pushing the gurney, who's on it, et cetera, et cetera. And so I say this to say that it can be that pernicious. You can be focused on this in your day-to-day life. You can be focused on this in your day-to-day life, and something slips through your fingers. So I want you to think about what's that thing, that's that blind spot that's slipping through my fingers. Is it as simple as background casts? Is it something else like those meeting ideas that I just talked about? So again, and if you take anything from today, Shonda is with you. We are all in this together. And so the last bit about inclusion is how inclusivity on screen actually drives people to think about themselves differently off screen. It's one of my biggest talking points in any room that I'm in. This is from the television show CSI. So how many here have watched CSI or one of the 4 CSIs at some point? Oh, good. Odds are good. Look at that. So CSI, or Crime Scene Investigators, is about the use of forensic science and forensic scientists in solving crimes on a weekly basis. So it's a police procedural. And when CSI came out in the year 2000, 5 years later, there was a 50% increase in the number of forensic science majors in the United States and in the UK. 50% increase. And it's now been dubbed the CSI effect by researchers. It has a name. And there was an over-indexing of women in that spike because of that woman right there in the middle of the screen, played by Marge Hellerberg, which is pretty amazing. And it's actually, I believe to this day, don't quote me, but I believe to this day, it's still the only science, technology, engineering, or math STEM profession that has gender equity, gender parity at 50-50. And so this is the effect of what the images we actually put on screen can have right back into all of us in society, right? It can have an impact on how we see ourselves or what we think is possible or what we know is out there for us. And this is an example from our own world, both at Disney and animation, as well as from The Hunger Games. So Brave, Princess Merida, and Katniss Everdeen from The Hunger Games. Both of these movies came out in 2012, and that same Gina Davis, the actor, you know, she's an Olympic-level archer, as one is. She took up archery, I believe, at the age of 40 and qualified for the Olympic trials at the age of 41. May we all be her. And so she looked at this photo and immediately saw a little like me bias, that they were both archers, right? You see the bow and arrow in the screen, and they're both women. And so she had the idea, well, what influence might have this had on girls' participation in archery? So they did a study. Since 2012, when these movies came out, and I think they published a study in 2016 or 2017, there was a 50% increase in girls' participation in archery in the United States, as notated by the U.S. Archery Organization. And 7 out of 10 girls, or 70% of girls, said that it was directly due to Princess Merida or Katniss Everdeen as to why they got interested in archery. So this is the impact of what inclusivity on screen can do for all of us every day, and what that intersectionality of profession and identity can do, both in forensic science and in archery. So think about all the other professions we showed on screen in different ways, how cool that might be, especially if we need people in those jobs, as I like to say. So what can you do? The little recap. So unconscious bias is the result of shortcuts that our brain takes because of the amount of data we have to process at any given moment. So I want you to keep that always in the back of your mind and be attuned to it. We're always battling it. It's always there for us, waiting. And then when we look at diversity, inclusion, and belonging, remember, it's being invited to the party, diversity. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Remember all the dancing we just talked about, being asked to dance and all those examples. And belonging is that your music is played and you can boogie, remember? So that every day when we go into any space, it's a space that belongs to all of us and each of us at the same time. Belonging will be, newsflash, our topic next year. So I want you to always keep that in mind as we continue the conversation on inclusion throughout this year, is how are we making spaces where people are invited, and then how are we making them safe and feel inclusive with the music that's being played, yeah? And so with that, a few things to think about is what I always end on, which is knowing and sharing your data, questioning the stories, getting creatively excited, and putting the plan in motion. These are the things to remember. So again, what do you know and how do you know it, and what more do you want to know? Question the stories, both literally and figuratively, the stories you tell yourself and the stories we put on the screen, right? So what are those defaults we keep going to, and how can we question them, turn them on their heads? Get creatively excited. This stuff is super, super cool, super cool. It's sort of an exciting boon of creativity. So think about what happened in those late night rooms, you know, with John Oliver and Samantha Bee. Think about what happened in Glenn's room when he made that no interruption rule. It makes creativity better, more fruitful, deeper. It's the thing to get excited about. It's not a burden, it's a benefit. It unlocks us all, and quite frankly, it's a financial benefit if you looked at any of that data I shared with you pretty unequivocally, right? And so if you're getting excited, then you have to put that plan in motion. It's not enough to just leave here today and say, I'm going to be inclusive. I'm going to fight my unconscious biases. That's great, but we got to do things about it. So I want you to think about, what's that one thing after today's summit that I want to commit to, either in my organization or in my work, that's around inclusivity. It's around combating my unconscious biases. It's around making a culture of belonging. And I want you to put that plan in motion and keep yourself accountable, whether it's with your team and you keep each other accountable, or it's just with yourself. The easiest way to do this is to take a Post-it note, a sticky note, write what it is you're committing to, and stick it on your computer monitor or on your desk, somewhere you have to look every day so it reminds you. Because this is a habit, it's a practice, and we have to do it every day to fight those unconscious biases and to be consciously inclusive in everything we do. So today, as you think about all the knowledge you're going to get through the day, I want you to think about, what does it mean to be inclusive really? And what can I be doing each and every day to fight those blind spots and to put an active action plan into motion? And so with that, I want you to think about these questions. What are you going to commit to? And also, how can we help? How can women in animation help you and you help us in that journey, so that we continue long after today in our discussion around inclusion and take it through the year and into beyond, so that we can continue to strive for the representation and equity, and also to see those results that we're all looking for, both from a creative standpoint and from a business standpoint. And if none else of that is convincing, I want you to remember Betty, because at the end of the day, everybody is looking for their ugly Betty. And so we need to ensure that she exists somewhere for each and every one of us out in the world and in content. And with that, I leave you, and we're going to transition into the next gen panel. So thank you so much.